Okay. So, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, vicini e lontani used to be said in Italy when we are connected also to people who are attending the lecture from remote. Welcome to this 30th edition of the Kanizsa Lecture. This is an exceptional occasion. A few words from the, let's say, from the Gestalt theory and application society. The organizers Tiziano asked me to remind you that this is a special situation in which the Kanizsa Lecture is included in the program of a larger event, and we are very pleased to have it as a public lecture included in a larger event, as happened in the past sometimes. And so, as an organizer, together with Carlo Fantoni and Paolo Bernardis of the Kanizsa Lecture, I'm grateful to the society and to the local organizers of this event for the hospitality. So let me say a few things about the Kanizsa Lecture first. Here you have the list of the events from 1993, when the University of Trieste decided to have this public lecture as a way of celebrating the founder of the Trieste School of Experimental Psychology, Gaetano Kanizsa, in the same year of his death. In October, Irving Rock was the first speaker of this long list. And it is also important to stress the fact that we had as a first speaker somebody who was recognized as an opponent from the theoretical point of view of the Gestalt theory, being a representative of the Helmholtzian approach in perception. The goal of the lectures is to disseminate knowledge about a field of research independent of the specific approach, theoretical approach, and the field of research is defined broadly as the interface of perception and cognition. And if you look at the titles of the different lectures, you have a sense of this, of the complexity of this interface, including sometimes language, sometimes thinking, but mainly the level called middle vision that Kanizsa contributed to define. Some of the lectures were closely related to Kanizsa work or to phenomena that Kanizsa discovered or invented, like in the case of Johann Wagemans, who devoted a lecture to the Kanizsa triangle, or to, like in the case of Nakayama, who spoke about the surfaces as units of visual processing. But most speakers were just talking about their own view of perspective or on perception and cognition. That's what is the unifying theme. And we are, in this sense, especially grateful to Charles Spence for having accepted to be the speaker of this 30th lecture, because we were looking for a figure, a scientific figure covering a field that was not covered in previous presentations, and we were looking for an outstanding figure. And as I will try to show you, we have reasons for being grateful to Charles for having accepted to be here today. Just a few words about his career. He got his PhD in Cambridge in 1995 under supervision of John Driver on audiovisual links in attention. I hope it is correct. Well, okay. And he became, let's make a jump, not too big jump. He became professor in experimental psychology in Oxford 11 years later, where he is now the head of the Crossmodal Research Laboratory. A Crossmodal is the label that is recurrent in his production, in at least a large part of his production, large part of his large production. And he has been awarded several prizes, but here I want to remind you just a few. Among others, the Ig Nobel for a very serious problem, the contribution of sound to appreciation of food, with Massimiliano Zampini, a pupil of yours, right? Understand? Yeah, a student of yours. Most of you, I think, are familiar with a topic that Kafka discusses at the beginning of the Principles of Gestalt Psychology, the distinction between multum and multa. That was something that I learned from Kanizsa, who was insisting very much that multum is much more important than multa in science. Well, this is obviously true, we agree, but there are exceptional individuals, and Charles is one, where multum and multa coexist. So think of his published papers from Spence and Driver, 94, to Spence and Di Stefano this year, that include over 50 papers per year over a period in the last decade, the recent decade, with a peak of 61 in 2015, which is, I think, very impressive. And another record is, another top figure is the 1,400 citations of a review paper on cross-modal correspondences that I think everybody working in the field has appreciated, and everybody's grateful to Charles for having spent time, a lot of time, collecting all that material and presented and organized in such a way. Something which is also impressive is the number of citations, which is growing from 2015 till now and reaching a peak close to 8,000 citations per year. So this is about multa, clearly, but if you want to appreciate the depth of his thinking and his contribution, you should look, just read a few of his review papers. The one that I just mentioned, but more recent one on different topics like flavor, scent, and the cinema, or something in the field of architectural design, something in the field of wine psychology, or about the color of food. These review papers, for me, are impressive because if you want to know everything on a topic, and you are lucky enough to discover a review paper written by Charles, well, you are just sure that you will find everything there. You just read, and you have to be grateful for the effort in organization and coverage of the topic. This is remarkable. It depends on your curiosity, of course, because in this area there are some questions that are very often posed to you by friends and colleagues, and often answers are just there. Well, he is also remarkable for having a special ability to put together the lab, the experimental work in the lab, and what is called popular interest toward science. And some of his books, this is just a few that I mentioned, are exactly on this specific topic, like The Perfect Meal, Gastrophysics, also translated in Italian, and Sense Hacking, more recent, that is presented as, especially the last, as a perfect example of popular science at its best. So we have high expectations about Charles for his presentation. We are also we thank him for choosing a topic which is clearly relevant to people interested in Gestalt theory. And we all remember the problem posed by Köhler in Gestalt psychology when talking about Takete and Maluma phenomenon. And he will be talking about cross-modal correspondences in grouping effects. And we are eager to hear and learn from him. So, to you, the one and only, Charles Spence. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'll try and live up to. Probably won't quite manage. And it is a pleasure and honor to be here and to share some of the research around crossmodal and multisensory perception and some of the current thinking in that space. We'll get on to the edible Gestalt psychology after the coffee break. But I was instructed to do something a bit more sort of theoretical and empirical in the first half, which I shall attempt to do. And really, I think, if I try and sort of summarize what it's about, it's kind of a current obsession around sort of sensory translation, the question of perceptual similarity and whether or not that exists between the senses, and the kind of problematic absence of cross-modal or multisensory gestalts. So things you think should be there, or at least I think should be out there, but which many psychologists for an awfully long time have sort of failed to find evidence for these sort of grouping principles operating across the senses. And I want to try and share our sort of current thinking about why that might be. And this is work that I've been lucky enough to start collaborating with Niccolo Di Stefano, who was here this morning, I'm told, but has disappeared back to Venice or Rome today. And we've got a series of papers just out in iPerception and also under review now on these sort of questions about coloured hearing, colour music, colour organs, and the search for these perceptually meaningful correspondences between colour and sound. And I guess these are all examples, things like the colour organ, colour music, of sort of a ubiquitous interest, I would say, in sensory translation. And that in fact one can go back millennia and find everyone from the ancient alchemists who would be sort of connecting the planets to colours, to tastes, and to musical notes. And in a sense, one can think of that as a kind of attempt to translate or match or map one kind of sensation onto another. And this notion of how, or even if, we can translate from one sense to another is very sort of prominent nowadays with the growth of interest in sensory substitution devices for those who are blind or deaf, say. Here just one example from Aboud and colleagues, or this from Hamilton Fletcher in the UK and colleagues, trying to translate the colour of the fruits and vegetables you see on the bottom of the screen into tones and other sounds. And the question there, well, is there a meaningful mapping or an intuitive mapping between the colour that has been lost to the blind individual and the sounds that we choose to represent those hues? And I think there's an intuition that goes back over the millennia that yes, indeed, there are some sort of meaningful correspondences, if you will, between the senses. And if we can utilize those, we can, for example, make more intuitive, more likely to be used sensory substitution devices, or we can make more entertaining color organs. This from 1895, Alexander Wallace Remington in London with his color organ, sort of performed in London 1895. And there he was, you can see his organ. The idea was you sort of play the notes and you would be presented with a sequence of colors. And hopefully if he got his mapping right between musical notes and hues, the color symphony that this kind of device would play would be harmonious, pleasing as a result. So here translating between hearing and vision, in this case for an entertainment purpose. And if one goes back to around that time, a little earlier, and sees the kind of belief that what this potential to translate the senses could deliver, then if you find people like Gestalts are reckoning back in the 18th century that every home in Paris would one day have an ocular harpsichord for recreational purposes, a color organ in each and every home. Clearly that early enthusiasm has not materialized. And one might wonder whether the problem is one of technology or simply not having found the appropriate mapping between, or translation between hearing and vision. More successful examples, I guess, of the attempt to match and pair or combine audition and vision. Perhaps the most famous and successful example from Disney's Fantasia, where we had 7 pieces of classical music performed by Leopold Stokowski, paired with the action on screen. Disney himself was also interested in trying to add smell to Fantasia, though dropped the idea at the last minute. So this is sort of the potential what you might get if you can find a good alignment between hearing and vision, one of the most successful, I guess, of sort of cartoon movies of all time. And then if you just look through those sort of science, technology, innovation kind of popular magazines of the last century, you come across other kinds of organ, not just the color organ, that attempted to translate between one sense and another. And here you see a couple of guests with their mouths wrapped around tubes, and they're being given a taste symphony, translating the musical notes there into a range of flavors as shown on the top of the organ. There's something that you may see in sort of in Brave New World, Aldous Huxley talking about the herbal capriccios, and it's kind of a version of that. Huysmans as well. Against Nature also have sort of a version of this kind of device. A lot of interest, but again, this hasn't seemed to have come to pass. No one has a taste organ in their home, nor has anyone, I think, had the pleasure of a taste symphony. And from the sort of the art professors like Remington, through the sort of engineers creating their taste organs, picked up by the novelists. Then you also have the chemists who are interested in perhaps translating between the senses. Here, I think the English-born but French-working Charles Henry Septimus Pierres with his gamut of odours. sort of 50 different olfactory notes, and he paired each of those scents to a specific musical note, shown here. And his sort of idea was that you could, by combining musical notes that would sort of create harmonious combinations, you could pick also olfactory notes to achieve the same result. And this notion, this is from about 1860, and is perhaps one of the first examples, if you will, of a cross-modal correspondence between olfaction and pitch written down. We've been trying to replicate this work to see whether Pièz's intuitions map on to you or I's cross-modal mappings, what we think is right. But the issue is somewhat clouded because I think musical notes changed their definition ever so slightly in 1860-something. And this was done before the change in musical scoring. I should say I'm not a musician. That's why I collaborate so much with Niccolo to sort of put me right. But I'm very interested in these translations from music elsewhere that start with the chemists in the 1860s, but then keep going to the contemporary, to the last decade. Here we have a North American engineer, Chan Chen, who has loosely based on Pièz's Gematterbodas, translated olfactory notes into musical notes. And the idea here is you can play a musical piece, and each time you touch one of the musical keys, a drop of the corresponding or matching scent is collected in a vial. And by the end of this musical score, you will have a perfume that sort of captures or translates that musical score into scent. And then we have the others who are really interested in translating between the senses, the wine writers, in particular, who very often end up using sort of flowery language to try and describe to their readers what a wine tastes like for those who can't literally taste it in the moment. And here we have British wine writer Hugh Johnson talking about how I have tasted first attempt Chardonnays that were like Dizzy Gillespie solos, all over the place, and the colour of his trumpet too. On the other hand, a Stony Hill Chardonnay recently had the subtle harmonies and lilting vitality of Bix Beiderbecke. Robert Mondavi's Cabernets are like Duke Ellington numbers, and so it goes on. You might think, is this just a wine writer trying to fill up a page, his latest book, or is he communicating something meaningful to the reader? Can I really get a sense of what that wine might taste like from these musical matches? Until recently, that question has been sort of left open, whether you can translate from wine to music. But when I have audiences around the dinner table to do sort of gastrophysics events, I'll very often have them withholding a glass of white and red wine. But hopefully for you, you can imagine the taste of a white or a red wine. And if I now just play two pieces of classical music, and if you just think about, is there a correspondence? If you had to pick one of these pieces of music for the wine, which way would it go? So here we have piece number one. And you're thinking, is there a natural match there, natural correspondence to white or to red wine? Then we have our second piece of classical music. And most people would say that second piece of music, Camina Burana, that goes with red wine. And if you have a table full of people and they all sort of stick, 9 out of 10 people stick their red wine glass into the air when they hear that second piece of music while lifting their white wine glass to the first, then that kind of shows everyone in the room that there's something that needs to be explained, that there is a meaningful match between music and even pre-composed music and wine. And we can assess that more formally in studies with ranges of wine, ranges of pieces of music. Here we have some very fancy wines, 300-400 euros a bottle, and we had people, expert wine tasters, expert musicians, and just regular drinkers, tasting these 4 wines, 2 white and 2 wet red, and assessing the musical match from these 8 pieces of classical music. And what we find there is when we play this piece, Mozart's flute quartet, then the ratings are much higher for the main Didier Dagenot Puy Fumé, the white wine, than for anything else. This wine is a very bad match for Tchaikovsky's string quartets. But when we play the Tchaikovsky piece, instead the mapping reverses, and now everyone is rating the Chateau Margaux, the red wine, as the best match for that. And we can assess these correspondences then between music and taste, and then play them back to people in tasting events or music concerts, and show they will rate the combined experience of music and matching wine as a significantly more enjoyable multisensory experience than the individual components, or when you have no music or a mismatching music instead. And finally, of those who I think are interested in trying to translate between the senses, are the kind of the synesthetic marketeers, those who are trying, in their adverts online in magazines, and they're trying to convince you about the taste, the flavor, the experience of something. Even like this television here, we have some sort of synesthetic marketing as pioneer. What do they tell us about it? Seeing and hearing like never before. Go beyond sight as you know it. Go beyond sound as you have ever imagined it could be, where the eye bites into a red so juicy it explodes in a gush and runs down your cheek, where colors can be felt, sounds can be tasted, and it all comes together to create something completely unique. There are many such examples of this kind of synesthetic marketing out now. It's a very popular approach these days. It appears for tech. It appears for bags of crisps. Here's one of the examples we've been working on for fun. We have Sensations, crisps and walkers, 2 of 7 varieties of flavor. We've got balsamic vinegar and caramelized onion on the right, roast chicken and thyme on the left. And you can see each flavor is matched with a color. The balsamic vinegar should be sort of a purple, the roast chicken is a yellowy green. But as you look in detail at the S's there, you can see different musical instruments have been embedded in the packaging, again, to try and communicate. And so in our sort of research in the lab, we will take people in, give them these 7 flavors of potato chip blind, so they don't know which flavor they're tasting, and then ask them as they taste it to pick the musical instrument that they think would match, that would correspond with the taste profile. Pick the color. And in this case, we were able to demonstrate that the marketeers, the intuitive matches that they had picked, perhaps based on synesthesia, were not the matches that our participants chose. And the packaging was soon thereafter redesigned, whether because of our results or not, I'm not sure. But this is a growing area of marketing and also of design, as in Michael Haverkamp's book on synesthetic design. So you put all those things together, then one can say that for millennia, from the ancient alchemists to today's sensory marketeers, the wine writers, the entertainers, the engineers, the chemists, they've all been interested, wanted to be able to translate between the senses for informational purposes, for entertainment purposes, to make up for the loss of a sense or a sense that they cannot directly stimulate in you, the reader or audience. So that's great. There's a lot of interest. But then the question becomes, okay, how do we figure out what corresponds with what? Whether there is a translation, and what is the best translation to use. And here I think that sort of first problem emerges that the two traditional approaches to pairing the senses or translating from one to the other have led everyone astray for centuries now, in fact. But the most obvious thing that everyone thinks of when they think about the senses being connected is synesthesia. They think of people like Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian artist, those who see colored numbers and days of the week, these sort of rare individuals with their idiosyncratic inducer concurrent relations. But to the extent that many of these synesthetes have ended up in the creative industries and arts, there's a sense that maybe synesthesia gives you preferential access to these connections between the senses. And hence one can create sensory translation systems based on what a synesthete tells us, rather than relying on data from the rest of the non-synesthetic population. And this sort of idea goes back a century or two now, but I think it's misguided, because I think what's more important are the correspondences we share, non-synesthete or synesthete, rather than these idiosyncratic pairings that only a small number of synesthetes have, and which differ from one synesthete to another. And the sort of synesthetic approach always tends to be focused in just on pairing individual stimuli. So we have Kandinsky here in, I think his 1913 book, suggesting that the sound of the trumpet is scarlet. This is the translation between color, scarlet, and the timbre of the trumpet. He writes, light, warm red in music, it's a sound of trumpets, strong, harsh, and ringing. Now, it may be true that other writers have also wanted to connect those specific color and sound. One can go centuries earlier and find people like Locke and Leibniz, both writing about the blind man who apparently understands what scarlet is because of it being compared to the sound of the trumpet. So you can find these occasional matches between specific timbres or individual stimuli based on synesthesia, but that doesn't really give you a full palette of correspondences to be able to translate a range of stimuli. That said, it is in a widespread approach. You find it in the writing of Baudelaire and Nabokov, both synesthetes who embed kind of this sort of synesthetic metaphor in their works. One finds it also in Alexander Scriabin, another Russian artist, composer, and he's sort of a really interesting case in as much as when he came to the UK, to Cambridge in 1913, the composer was tested by C.S. Myers in the University of Cambridge to see whether he was really a synesthete or whether he was just pretending to be because it was trendy around that period. So we have some evidence about Scriabin's synesthesia, and we also have kind of the evidence from Prometheus' poem of fire, one of Scriabin's works, that came not just with a musical score, but also with a visual light show to be presented in synchrony with the music. He, like Disney, was also thinking about adding smell to his audio-visual music concert in order to deliver the kind of total work of art. And here you can just see, I think it's from Yale University in 2009, they put on a version of a poem of fire with the colors, quite amorphous, dynamic in appearance. So it's kind of like the color organ of Rimington. And we find from the description from one individual who saw one of these multisensory works, from Wells, who writes, one has only to trace the remarkable unfolding of harmonic color in Scriabin's later works to realize that it was harmony, above all, that prompted him to seek a visual counterpart to his music. An equivalence of oral harmony and visual is so strongly implied in Scriabin's later works that for me they seem to emanate from a single source, So if you're looking for that sort of multisensory Gestalt cross-modal unity, it seems like you might have found it here. The author tells of events leading up to finding a possible link between musical harmony and visual colour based on complementarity. The parallelism of musical harmony with visual colour departs radically from current hypotheses of tonal organisation. So a suggestion here, if you get that mapping between hearing and vision right, you can deliver some sort of emergent multisensory experience that is perhaps bigger than the sum of the parts. The problem being that the light work was never presented in Scriabin's lifetime, and the code for the colours was lost for decades, I think only recovered in 1976, I believe. But there it is, I think, from the Russian museums, Scriabin's 12 light loose. And from those who have looked at the actual mapping and use of colour in the work, then they suggest that the choice of colours was not based on Scriabin's own synesthetic connections, which we can trace back to Myers at the University of Cambridge, but instead he was using colour to disambiguate particular musical notes. So he's really serving a disambiguating function rather than to illustrate synesthesia. And if one looks around, we can find from Scriabin, from Kandinsky, from Zorsky, all of these artists who claimed to be synesthetes. Some we have evidence to think that they actually were. And they all come up with their own translations between musical notes and colours. And here we have Scriabin's mapping and Rimsky-Korsakov, another Russian from around the same time. And it sort of illustrates the problem that when you try and establish the translation between two senses based on the idiosyncratic colour concurrence of a synesthete, because they're idiosyncratic, they differ from one synesthete to the next. And we can see the note F here was red and dark for Scriabin, green and clear for Rimsky-Korsakov. Up at the top, we've got C major was white for Rimsky-Korsakov, red for Scriabin. So who's right here? Who has got the most intuitive or right, if either of them, translation between sound and colour? I think neither of them have, and I think the whole synesthetic approach has been misguided and sort of striking how many people have been led in by the vivid concurrence of synesthetes into trying to communicate between the senses based on that synesthesia. But I think that's sort of underlying here, when you look at all the attempts to translate between the senses, the majority of attempts have always been between hearing and vision. And you might think, well, why is that the case? If I could translate from any one sense to any other sense, why is hearing and vision the preference over hearing being translated into taste, or taste into smell, or smell into colour? No, it's hearing and vision that most research has gone on. So why is that? Is that somehow a more intuitive mapping between the senses than the others? And then once I've decided, okay, I want to translate sound into vision or vice versa, then the question is, which dimension of experience do I choose? Do I pick pitch or timbre, loudness or tempo, hue, saturation or lightness, perhaps even shape? Which is the dimension that people go for? And again, are there particular combinations that people seem to preference over others? Because if there are, that again might provide guidelines for anyone trying to come up with a new translation system. Do it between these two senses, because it's more intuitive, and do it between these particular dimensions, because they seem to work better. So synesthesia, I think, has not worked in providing consensual translation between pairs of senses, in particular hearing and vision. And the second main approach that comes in, really back in with Isaac Newton in 1704, when he matches musical notes to colours, It's kind of the idea of a structural mapping between the senses. And here we have the art historian Sir Ernst Gombrich talking about this transition from these useless kind of synesthetic matches to a structural attempt to go from one sense to another. And he suggests that we should focus our attention on the structural relationships in the system rather than on the similarity of the elements. That would be the synesthetic approach. The problem of synesthetic equivalences will cease to look embarrassingly arbitrary and subjective if we fix our attention not on likeness of elements, but on structural relationships within a scale or matrix. By which I take him to mean that you should try and look, if you're trying to translate from one dimension to another, think about the structure of the dimension and find one that matches. And that's maybe why people have gone from hearing to vision, because both hearing and vision can be conceptualized as circular dimensions, and hence the structure of sort of pitch and color space has a sort of natural mapping there. And it's this sort of structural similarity that has led many to want to combine pitch and hue. Starting, as I said, with Isaac Newton with his 7 colors for the musical notes. So I can sort of understand why people have gone down this route, because of the similar structure of the kind of the experiential space of pitch and hue. And I can see how, over the years, again, just like the synesthesia approach, all manner of scientists, composers, and artists have come up with their own structural mapping between the musical notes, from Newton to Gestalt, who made with the early ocular harpsichord, and others. But once again, even though they're using a different approach to mapping or to translating from hearing and vision, again, they can't seem to agree on which color goes with which note. But it didn't really sort of stop them trying. One can find chemists, architects, music scholars, psychologists, other kinds of theorists who've all tried to take that structural approach to mapping from hearing to vision. Here, the English chemist from 1835, trying to match music to color. Here, I think this is Wells, a different kind of sort of circular arrangement of color to music from 1980. A few years later, Pridmore, I think he's an engineer, coming up with his own sort of structural analogy between music and color. And there are loads of these mappings in Leonardo, Color Research and Application, and other journals. And what interests me is both the fact that all of these individuals, when you read these papers, they are convinced that they have got the right mapping. And yet they all disagree with each other. So even the structural approach to aligning the senses does not seem to work. And I want to ask you, why would people be so confident? Why wouldn't they just say, this is a hypothesis, it might be true? Why does each and every one of them say, this must be the way that you translate hearing to vision, because of the structural similarity of the circular dimensions? I don't have an answer to that, but he's sort of curious here, these mappings proposed as absolute truths when clearly no one agrees with anyone else. So they haven't reached consensuality. So this just leads me then to wrap up and say, if the synesthetic approach to cross-modal translation has not worked, and if the structural approach recommended by Gombrich and implemented by others also fails to deliver a consensual mapping, then what? Is there anything else we can do to help those who are, for example, trying to design a sensory substitution system that is intuitive? And that's where I would put in the kind of the correspondences here instead, to say that we all share these mappings between pitch and hue, but that doesn't make us synesthetes, because we do not have color concurrence. And these mappings we all experience, that we all think boob is the round shape, kiki is the angular shape, are kind of consensual. There's no right answer, but there's a commonly agreed answer. And hence, if you can build sensory translation based on these shared correspondences without getting distracted by synesthesia, then maybe we will be in a good place to deliver the rules for translation. And so the correspondences here would say this sort of mapping of one dimension of experience onto another. We all think lower pitch goes with larger objects, higher pitch is smaller, higher, brighter, lighter. There are a whole range of these correspondences now that have been demonstrated to be shared between individuals, to be developed very early on, and hence potentially might provide the answer. All good. But just this brings us back finally to think about, if we accept that line, that correspondences provide the consensual mapping between the senses, is it right, as I suggested in 2015, to think of crossmodal correspondences as a kind of Gestalt grouping by similarity? In the same way you might group the black dots and the white dots here, because they perceived as similar. If one looks throughout the whole of kind of the Gestalt literature, there's lots on visual Gestalt, lots of auditory Gestalt, a little bit on tactile Gestalts. But can you find a crossmodal Gestalt? I've failed. I can see various studies published, 80s and 90s and 70s, where people have tried to find apparent motion between a sound and a light. They just can't get it. So the conclusion for a long time has been that perhaps crossmodal Gestalts do not exist. But if there's anything in that direction, are correspondences, the thing we've been missing as a kind of a measure of crossmodal perceptual similarity. That's what I thought a couple of years ago, but as the more I think about it and the more research we look at, I sort of come to realize that even the correspondences don't provide the kind of answer that one might want. And that's because of my kind of going back. I used to think Helmholtz was completely wrong when he talked about perceptual similarity between the senses. But now I suspect he's probably right after all. And what did he say back in 1878? He writes that the distinction among sensations which belong to different modalities or senses, such as the differences among blue, warm, sweet, and high-pitched, are so fundamental as to exclude any possible transition from one modality to another, and any relationship of greater or lesser similarity. For example, one cannot ask whether sweet is more like red or more like blue. Comparisons are possible only within each sensory modality. We can cross over from blue through violet and carmine to scarlet, and we can say that yellow is more like orange than like blue, but what we cannot do is judge perceptual similarity between hearing and vision, say. And I used to think he was wrong, because I think, if I asked you the question, is red or blue sweeter, we find in thousands of people around the world, they'll all say that red is sweeter color, pink is a sweet color. So you can answer that question about which color goes along with or corresponds to sweetness, but maybe that's a different question from the one about, is it perceptually similar? Now, not everyone agrees with Helmholtz. There are others out there, people like Lawrence Marks in the States, recently retired psychophysicist, who's thought a lot about synesthesia and cross-modal language, metaphor, and so on. And he's convinced that you can judge perceptual similarity between the senses. He makes no reference to Helmholtz's earlier claim. He just asserts boldly that perceptual similarities between and among sensory experiences in different modalities, much as the color aqua is more similar phenomenologically to cerulean than to pink, the flavor of lime more similar to lemon than to banana, so too are low notes played on a bassoon or an organ more like dark colors such as brown or black than bright colors such as yellow or white. So for Marx, he believes you can make judgments of perceptual similarity between the senses, diametrically opposed to Helmholtz, but he doesn't tell us, maybe he hasn't read to Helmholtz or forgotten about it, and you want to know who of these two are right. Because if Marx is right, and you can judge perceptual similarity between the senses, that would support the claim of cross-modal correspondences being a kind of Gestalt grouping by similarity. But if Helmholtz is right, then that possibility is denied to you, because there is no perceptual similarity to be rated. And hence that's would not be the right way to think about the situation. And I don't want to go into all the details, but to say I have gone back 200 years trying to see who's right, Marx or Helmholtz. And I find many, many people over the last century or two who've been struggling to find this perceptual match between hearing and vision. But in every case I can find, from North America to Europe, from 1900 to 2000, every single writer, researcher ends up concluding is that there is no perceptual similarity. The best you can get when comparing hearing and vision is emotional similarity. You pair what you see and what you hear because you feel the same way about them. You have the same affective response, but there is no perceptual similarity. And that then leads me just to conclude that if one says all of the cross-modal correspondences are not based on perceptual similarity between the senses, but are instead based on this emotional mediation or emotional mapping, then maybe I've got a response to Erich von Hornbostel, who writes back in 1927 in a quote that I put at the beginning of my cross-modal correspondences article, when he says, what is essential in the sensuous perceptible is not that which separates the senses one from another, but that which unites them. Unites them amongst themselves, unites them with the entire, even with the non-sensuous experience in ourselves, and with all the external world that is to be experienced. What is essential is not what separates the senses, but what links them. And what is it that links them? My conclusion is that it is not perceptual similarity, much though I've long wished that to be the case. Rather, affective similarity, matching stimuli, auditory or visual or any other combination of senses, because they evoke or are associated with a similar mood, emotion, or feeling. That's all you've got, I think. And if that's the case, if all we've got to connect color and pitch is a feeling we have about the component stimuli, then that might explain why you don't find those cross-modal Gestalt grouping examples that people, myself and many others, have been looking at for a century. Because if the cross-modal grouping is based on emotional similarity, you don't have the perceptual similarity that might provide a stronger pull. So to conclude then, for the first part, I think the question of sensory translation is very interesting and runs through millennia of psychology and just general behavior and interest from many different disciplines. I think the two main approaches that have been tried over the last 2 centuries or more, the synesthetic approach and the structural approach to mapping hearing to vision, neither of them have worked to deliver a consensual translation. That leaves us only with cross-modal correspondences as a way of translating, going between or connecting one sensory impression and another. But that connection is based on emotion, not on perceptual similarity, and hence it is quite weak. It probably doesn't have enough gradation. I don't think there's enough distinction between different emotional states to provide you with a rich kind of a range of translations. You only have a few basic emotions probably, and hence I think we're sort of stuck in a way. I would wish it was otherwise, but I don't know how one can translate then ultimately between the senses, and this millennia-long attempt might be in vain. And with that, I shall time for a coffee.
Maybe not so much questions, but one, two things that came to my mind. So one, when you first presented, for instance, I think it was Tchaikovsky or Mozart with something else, Carmina Burana versus, of course, the white wine has a clarity, a transparency that red wine doesn't have. And the Carmina Burana was like, had like a lot of these figural, contrastive dynamics of tension. The other one was more a resolution. So instead of really, just in isolation asking what corresponds to what, asking the participants as they listen to the music or to a tone, what that means to them, and then what the other thing means to them. And in music, of course, a fa, a do, is totally its function in terms of stability or instability, talking Gestalt terms and in music terms, totally depends on the context. So in music, no note in isolation is anything. It's then maybe just cultural things that get attached to them. So somehow it seems to me, has to be contextualized everything in terms, instead of these isolated matchings that the participants are asked to do.
So there are a few things there. One, you're right, it could be something, people might be matching the color of the wine and not the taste or flavor of it. But we've addressed that by getting people to match music just to different red wines, to take the color element out, but we have worried about that. Then you say maybe it's something about the mood or emotion of the piece, and there are, some of the wine writers would say, red wine demands, angry music in the minor mode. So I think that the right appropriate level is sort of the emotion. Which sort of brings me back to where we end in a way. It's an emotional match. I do believe that I completely agree that the context and the grouping within the sense. So most of these attempts at translation, what they've always done is just present one light, one sound. Is that a good translation for that individual thing? But then, of course, in any real translation, there's going to be a whole sequence of notes, whole range of colors, and then the question becomes, do those colors group harmoniously? Do the notes make a chord, and so on? And that's going to completely override the intramodal grouping. I think an organization will completely override the crossmodal, sadly. But after the break, I will come back to that. So the starting point is taking pre-composed music that's pre-composed for something else and has ranges on a whole range of parameters. But what we do these days is construct music from the bottom up, asking, as you say, people for their associations with timbre, with pitch, with tempo, with roughness, with loudness, with mode, and then kind of create musical compositions to match the evolving flavor profile. And also sometimes use kind of semantic differential technique as a means of establishing, sort of active, passive, good, bad, dominant, submissive, and so on and so forth, meaning, or connotative meaning of the individual stimuli. And I do think that does provide a way then of, I'm still working my way through the relationship between emotional mediation of these correspondences and sort of semantic differential approach. But
just a small thing. In filmmaking, the use of the events in the film and music have a pronounced effect. And you said, there appear to be no cross-modal gestalts. But for instance, I think it was in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. I think that was the film where a very violent scene, war scene, was accompanied by a very soft music. And if you take the same scene with a very harsh music, the meaning it conveys, the Gestalt meaning, completely changes. And the old Russian film directors and art film directors are actually making use of these very interesting contrasts that change meaning, and that's cross-modal, it seems to be.
Yes, indeed. I think in those cases, I'll come back to some of those after the break. You can again similarly change the meaning of film, or change the meaning of food by the sort of sonic accompaniment you give it. And there, I think it's more about a transfer, for us at least, between what you feel about the music transfers to what you feel about the thing you're looking at or putting in your mouth. I don't think they come together as a whole. Clearly, there's a cross-modal influence. The music changes the way that the visual stimulus or the food is interpreted, but you don't have an emergent property, I think, about sort of, some sort of unity or emergence, just a transfer in that case. But I am very interested in the various sort of cinematographic sort of techniques and tricks. So there are a whole list of those sort of filmmakers' books to see all things around desynchronization and so on.
Just technical information. At 8 o'clock, we must leave the place. So my proposal is not to have the break. If you need a break, it should be very short. Do you need a break, our speaker?
No.
He does not need a break. So you don't. You want the next part of the... And if there are questions, other questions, I think we put them at the end of the lecture. So keep in mind questions of the first part. For...
We don't need more water, do we?
Yeah. Carlo, look for water. It's a very dry period, it is. So we save water.
Okay, without further ado then, on to the edible gestalts. It's sort of noticeable from the list of the previous Kanizsa lecturers. There was a lot of vision in there, a lot of hearing, a little bit of touch maybe somewhere. But the flavour senses, the chemical senses, got short shrift, as they so often do. Kind of lower senses, as some describe them. But I think there's a lot of fun to be had in the edible and in our work over the last decade or two in the lab, but also with chefs and artists, designers who've been trying to take psychophysics out of the lab into the real world to look at impact on tasting experiences. And along the way, using some Gestalt phenomena and examples as inspiration for the creation of sort of edible Gestalt. I think we can go that far. As was mentioned, this did come out as a Gestaltphysica in Italy a couple of years ago. Microphone. Okay. What's it on? No. With the light. Oh. That works. Yeah. And I want to share some of our experiments and some of the work we've done with chefs, because I think there's so much rich material in those sort of visual perception and Gestalt psychology textbooks that's never been translated into the culinary domain, but provides a lot of rich inspiration for those open-minded chefs out there who want to deliver different kinds of experiences to their guests. And I guess I have to sort of start off, as I did for the previous talk. This is all work done, or was initially done in collaboration with Max Zampini, now Professor Max Zampini, who's in the lab in Oxford, in my gold soundproof booth, answering the question that was the header from an article in Science, world's top science magazine supposedly: why is a soggy potato chip unappetizing? Because it's got the taste, it's got the fat, energy density, got the aroma. All it doesn't have is the sound of the crunch. But there's no nutritional value in noise, so why don't we like a soggy crisp? None of us. I think it's all around the sound of food, sort of drawing attention into our mouth. Most of our snack foods are crispy, crackly, crunchy. And together with Max, funded by Unilever, we had 20 undergraduates biting into 2 tubes of Pringles, perfect for sort of psychophysics research, because every Pringle is the same size and shape. And then to rate the staleness, freshness of those potato chips as we changed the sound of the crunch in real time, making it louder or quieter, or just boosting certain frequency bands. And we could show that we could make stale crisps taste fresher and more liked simply by making them noisier. Published in the Journal of Sensory Studies, and we were going to forget about it. It was just industry research. but then it won the Ig Nobel Prize, and my life was never the same afterwards. I've been working with crisps, crisp packets, crisp bags, and sound and food kind of ever since. Max here, I say, was very unsure about whether he wanted to pick up his Ig Nobel Prize, which he was awarded somewhere here in Italy, for fear that he'd never get a job in academia. But I guess that was not something he had to worry about, because he's now a professor in Trento. And it was that dish and all the publicity that came from the sonic chip, showing for the first time, I think, the importance of sound to our multisensory tasting experiences, that led on to this dish, the Sound of the Sea dish, that was served at the world's top restaurant, Heston Blumenthal's The Fat Duck in Bray, very close to Oxford, because the chef was one of a growing number of chefs who would come to Oxford, to the psychology, to physiology, to biochemistry labs, see what was going on, and then try and integrate the scientific insights into the dishes he was creating. And I see more and more chefs thinking that way now. I don't just want to learn from other chefs, from cookbooks, culinary academies, but what could a psychologist tell me about dining? And I think quite a lot, because I think the pleasures of the table reside in the mind, not in the mouth, because it's in our mind where the sound of the crunch, the sight, the smell, our mood, our emotion, nostalgia, storytelling, it all comes together up here, and our brain does this wonderful job of integrating everything and convincing us we're tasting it in our mouth. And so when he came out to the lab, we put him in our gold soundproof booth, the chef. He went away saying, wow, sound is the forgotten flavor sense. I never thought about sound before, but yes, it does transform the experience. And that led into this dish that's been the signature dish on the restaurant menu for a decade now, the Sound of the Sea, that comes looking like the seashore, with sashimi, sand, foam, seaweed, a conch shell, and earbuds. And the diners in the restaurant, in the world's top restaurant, hear the sound of the sea, the seagulls overhead, the waves gently crashing on the beach. It's not quite the sound of Trieste. I was sitting on the harbour this afternoon just listening out, and you don't have half as many seagulls as we have in England, I don't think. At least they're not as noisy. But it certainly works for our English diners, many of whom, should be said, journalists and just regular people who've gone to this restaurant cry. And that's in print from many journalists when they have this dish. And I want to say there's something funny going on, special going on here, something extraordinary, because we never cry over seafood, but people do cry over this. Is it some sort of aesthetic aha experience? They can't quite resolve what's going on. Is it because those sounds take people back to their childhood and trigger positive nostalgia that then colours the food experience? I don't know. Is it the fact when you put the earbuds in, you stop talking? And you're thinking, is that the sound of my childhood? Does it really change the taste of the seafood or not? But for those few minutes, you're really mindful in the moment. You're focusing on the food. You're not distracted by it, chatting to everybody else. And that's part of what makes the dish work so well. And this was done out of an experiment, Art Meets Science, in Oxford in 2006. We had 150 people, gave them oysters, played the sounds of the sea or farmyard chicken noises, and they all thought the oyster tasted significantly better with the seaside sounds than with chicken sounds. So that was kind of the inspiration. This is probably the first example of technology being brought to the dining table by the world's top chef who's delivering something beautiful on the plate, but who wants to deliver a total experience both on and off the plate with this technology. And this comes in 2007, it starts, it's still there to this day, as a once-in-a-lifetime exclusive experience. If you can get in there, you're not going to be able to afford to go back. So it's a technology being brought to the table to have diners realize the importance of sound to the experience, but it's the restaurant who's bringing it to you rather than people being enabled to use it themselves. And we thought this was really original, innovative, that had never been done before, until I got to read F.T. Marinetti's futurist cookbook. There he is, from 1932. And he, in Milan and elsewhere, was serving dishes of frogs' legs while playing the sounds of frogs. It's kind of the sound of the sea 70 years earlier. If any of you are what do you call it, a frog expert? Something like a mythologist or something? But that's not the right frog. That's not an edible frog, but you get the idea. And what he was doing, I think, was he was trying to discombobulate his guests. It wasn't about making food taste wonderful, but sort of provoking them instead. But nevertheless, so much of what's in the Futurist cookbook, either actually executed or just imagined, turns out to be exactly what the chefs are doing today, from eating without cutlery, to spraying perfumes in diners' faces, to rubbing textures, as we might see later. It's all there in the Futurist cookbook, and way ahead of its time, but for a different purpose, not to maximize enjoyment. But for us, we've taken these sort of insights about the importance of sound, going from the sound of the food to the sound of the environment to the sound of the sea, and then think about how we can position that for well-being and to nudge people towards healthier food behaviors or more sustainable food behaviors for the planet. And being here in Trieste, I guess, the water out there is probably full of jellyfish, because as the global temperatures rise, there are more and more jellyfish in the Mediterranean clogging up all sorts of stuff. We've got to get rid of them somehow, so why not eat them? It's kind of the idea. That would solve, they're going to be more sustainable as the temperatures warm up. But most people think, jellyfish? I don't like the idea of that. Jellyfish sounds jelly-ish, slimy and stuff. In fact, when you treat it, it has no taste, no flavor, it's just a crunch, it's just noise. But here we have a London chef, Youssef, another young chef interested in speaking to scientists, neuroscientists, psychological scientists, trying to incorporate the ideas into his dish. And he serves, with a projection mapping on his table in London, a jellyfish dish that looks like this. And it's the first dish on the menu, and he's putting it on there to try and give you a wonderful first jellyfish experience, so that if you have a great first experience, you'll be more likely to try it again if you see it in the supermarket or somewhere else. And that dish comes with the sort of projection of the sea, with the headphones that in this case play sort of multi-layer sound. We've got the blub blub blub, where the jellyfish were floating before they made their way to your table. But there's also embedded in the soundscape the periodic sound of the crunch. And what happens as diners eat this dish that is all crunch, no flavor, sometimes you crunch and the headphones crunch and your brain unifies them into kind of an experience. Other times you crunch but the headphones don't. The headphones do but you're not crunching. And so as it goes on, your brain's in this kind of constant state of trying to integrate or segregate these two sensory channels, what you're tasting and what you hear. And that creates a very sort of grabby experience. It's a bit like Bruce Nauman has a video called Lip Sync from 1967 or 69, where this video of an upside-down face shown close up is fading in and out of synchrony. And you can never quite resolve what's going on, and so it grabs your attention. I think the same thing happens here as these soundscapes come into alignment or do not. It wasn't planned as such, but it's just kind of the observation you find when you have diners enjoying the dish in the restaurant. And this sort of idea of experiential dining that goes beyond the food on the plate, if there is a plate, thinking about constructing multisensory environments that mirror, capture, enhance, harmonize with, accentuate, alter the food experience, has sort of gone global. Here's the world's most expensive restaurant, Sublimotion in Ibiza, 1,500 euros a head for a 24-course tasting menu. You see, you've got the Central Park, we've got gates of hell, underwater, projected on the walls. And I sort of believe that these environments will change the taste of the food, your emotional state. But as a psychologist, I can't test here, because I have to do a power analysis first these days, and that tells me I need 60 subjects to get significance and power, and 60 subjects at 1,500 euros each is not something my head of department will necessarily admit me to do. So instead, we have to take some of these ideas, things intuitive design, and then create experiences where we can test lots of people. This is very often around drinks, and in the first case we did was the Singleton Sensorium in 2013. 500 people over 3 nights, given a glass of whiskey and a scorecard. And they start off in the grassy room at the top. And you have the whiskey in your hand, your scorecard, and you've got to say how grassy on the nose, how sweet on the palate, how textured the aftertaste, how much do I like the decorations, how much do you like the whiskey right here, right now, in the moment. You then take your whiskey and scorecard into the second room. This is a very boober room, if you will. Everything is round, because round is a shape of sweetness. Boober's sweet, Kiki is bitter, sour, salty. Everything's pink and red and purple, because these are the colours of sweetness. The floor plan's round, the windows are round. And this soundscape has been deliberately constructed, tinkling high-pitched sounds coming from the ceiling, because sweet is high and also high in pitch. Rate the nose, the taste, the aftertaste of the whiskey. And then take your whiskey down to the woody room at the end. And here we're using sort of semantic cueing of woody textured stuff. We've got the sound of log fire, sound of the walk through the woods, sound of creaking wood doors, sound of the double bass. Everything woody we can think of, a dead tree behind the picture, stressed wood on the walls. Tell me about the nose, the taste, the texture, and your liking. And after 3 nights, even though the whiskey has not left people's hands, they can see their own scorecard and see that the grassiness on the nose of the whiskey is about 11% higher in the grassy environment. Sweetness, about 10% elevated in the sweet room, and the texture on the finish of the whiskey about 15% higher in the woody room. This was the room where people most enjoyed their whiskey, and to have people coming out of this experience saying, wow, I can see I said something different in the rooms. No one came out and said, I knew it was the same whiskey, and so I put the same score every time. They kind of engaged with the thing. And those who really enjoyed the whiskey in the woody room then went back to their bars and restaurants and started serving whiskey to guests off a wooden tray to try and capture a bit of this experience that they had themselves had. And what was becoming increasingly clear to me is I could show people a result, I could write a paper, and I might think if I got a significant result, that will mean something. But if it doesn't go with people's intuitions about how the world works, it will be ignored. But if you can deliver an experience that people can have themselves, that's a much more effective a route to changing behavior than anything else. So increasingly we're doing these sensoriums, sensplorations, trying to construct multisensory environments to modulate, change, taste, flavor, experience. At the same time, we're also working a lot on sight and the visual aspects of food. In part, given the fact that, to my colleagues in Oxford, I always want to say, even if you're not interested in food as a neuroscientist, you should be, given that the brain evolved to find, forage, pay attention to energy-dense foods. And within the blink of an eye, your brain can detect where the energy-dense stuff is in a scene and then pay attention accordingly. There's nothing that gets your brain, the body's most bloodthirsty organ, getting more blood pumping around than the sight of your favorite dish when you are hungry. A 24% increase in cerebral blood flow in this study from Wang and colleagues in Neuroimage in 2004. I mean, normally when you do a visual attention experiment, it's like a 0.1%, 0.2% shift. 24% is sort of unheard of, perhaps again hinting at the importance of food to the brain. And we work with the chefs and look at the various ways that what we see in food can affect us. We look at thinking about trying to translate from color to taste. So this is the amuse-bouche, a Synesthesia Dinner served in London in 2016. Chef Youssef plating up 4 spoons, 4 spherified balls that look like these. Spherified, so you can't smell anything, you can't taste anything until you put it in your mouth and it explodes. And this dish comes to the table, and it's like an experiment at the dining table, backed up by online research. The waitress comes out and just randomly puts those 4 spoons in front of you. And she says, this is the amuse-bouche from the chef. It's called the 4 tastes. We recommend you start with the salty spoon, then have the bitter spoon, then the sour, and make sure to end on a sweet note. And then she wanders away, and diners are left going, well, you didn't tell me which spoon is which. That's the whole point of the dish, is you have to rearrange your spoons in the order, or translate between color and taste. In this case, I've arranged them appropriately for you. 70% of people will say white is salty taste. About the same percentage online or in the restaurant think that the browny black is bitter, green is sour, and pinkish red is sweet. It's not 100% agreement because we want diners at the dinner table to disagree, and that creates, why did you think red was sweet? I thought, sugar is white, so the white should be. But having that conversation at the table and actually collecting data from diners in the restaurant in real time has been a lot of fun, and also for the diners too, who hopefully come away from this dish thinking a bit more about the importance of their sight and colour to taste. This a kind of correspondence incorporated into an experiential dish. And beyond the colour of the food itself, it turns out that the colour of the plate has a surprising effect. And in work with the world's top chef, Ferran Adrià, in Spain, back in 2012, and together with Bettina Piqueras-Fisman, we served this sort of what looks like a strawberry mousse on a black or white plate to about 67 people. Half started with a black plate, half started with a white plate, counterbalanced. And even though everyone was in the same room on the same day, eating the same batch, what they said about the strawberry mousse differed depending on the colour of the plate. They rated it as sweeter, more flavourful, and significantly more liked when it was served on the white plate than the black plate. I think it's kind of strange. You can't literally taste the plate, but the colour of the plate, the cup, the bowl, the can change your taste and flavour perception. Maybe it's a matter of colour contrast, that the pink looks pinker on white against black. Maybe it's a matter of associative learning over your lifetime. Black plates bring cheese, white plates bring sweet desserts. Or maybe it's about a matter of colour combination, because if we repeat the experiment, take the food away, and just give you a pink square on a white background, you will rate that colour pair as looking sweeter than any other colour pair. Has nothing to do with food, but we just kind of represented it here. So maybe the food is irrelevant to your sweetness judgment. It's about colour combination, foreground, background, side by side, and so on. So we might be able to use that then to say if we can actually increase sweetness perception simply by changing the colour of the plate, who wouldn't want to know about that? You could reduce the sugar in food and drink, but keep the perception the same, potentially, simply by optimizing plateware color. What we can also play with is the size of the plate, and here, using just the Delboeuf illusion, we've been working on food packaging. And this is kind of an interesting case where, if you look at breakfast cereals, they typically show a portion size that's 300% the recommended serving. They do that because that grabs your attention. It looks like there's more food, so you're more likely to buy that product and pay attention to it on the shelf. But then if you think about what happens if you're sitting at the breakfast table with your box of Special K in front of you, and you're trying to figure out how much should I serve myself this morning, it turns out that that portion on the front of pack acts as an anchor or guide for what you yourself deliver. But we've done the experiment now using the Delboeuf illusion to make the same amount of food look like there's more or there is less, simply by changing the size of the rim of the plate or bowl. And can show we can get the illusion of greater volume of food on the front of pack. So it does hopefully get consumers to be more likely to buy one packet rather than another. But when they come to pour themselves, their motor actions are not biased by the Delboeuf illusion. So it works on the shelf to get people to buy the product, but it doesn't nudge them towards eating more, as simply increasing the volume might be thought to do. One other example where we've sort of gone from the lab and visual illusions to the plate is shown in the top right here. This is research with Katsuo Okajima and his team of 70 vision scientists over in Yokohama in Japan. And here we've got augmented reality sushi with perfect veining, with perfect sheen, so quite a complex visual texture to render, and done, so we see that again, without any meta cookies, without any labels, QR codes. And every time you put your hand over the dish, you can change the fish. Thinking about a future when we've fished the seas to extinction of our favorite sushi fish, maybe we'll be eating the augmented version instead. And to the extent that this food is perhaps more visually dominant food than others, this kind of illusion might work. And some of the other sort of examples here of trying to go from the fancy world's best restaurant giving you the technology for a once-in-a-lifetime meal to ubiquitous technology in your pockets and in your dinner tables at home, things like tablets. How could they be repositioned to deliver the sound of the sea in your own home? We see already, this is a Swiss chef in a one-Michelin-star restaurant where for one of the courses he serves the dish off a tablet and the tablet's showing a bowl. You might go, well, what's the point of that? Why not just serve it in the bowl in the first place? But I just sort of see this as the creative of the kitchen, exploring the space. Some things will work, some things won't. But something will probably come out of this to figure out a kind of a usage case for why we should be using tablets at the dining table. Maybe it's because we can perfectly contrast the color of your tablet screen from the food that's placed on top. That might be one way to go, or to capture some of these other experiences. But it's this sort of ubiquitous tech that we're particularly interested in. And here going from, transitioning from work on, say, visual illusions of body size and then rubber hand illusion to visual illusions of food. There's kind of a nice crossover. And while some people might minimize the body size using augmented reality to see whether your arm hurts less if it looks smaller, then there are others in the food domain who are also trying to make your food look smaller to see if you will eat less or more. But beyond just the colors and color combinations of the food and or the plate, I think food can go far beyond that, and there's a growing sense in which many chefs think of themselves as artists, and often inspired by visual works of art in their culinary creations. And here on the right we have one of Kandinsky's paintings. We heard from him earlier, painting 201 that hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It actually hangs the other way up, but when the chef saw it, he said, if I plate a mushroom, it has to be upright. You can't have an upside-down mushroom. It'll look dead. So if you excuse the chef, Charles Michel, another young chef interested in psychology and how to incorporate it into dishes. Well, on the side of the painting here, it says, Kandinsky was an artist, a synesthete, who tried to communicate emotion through color and form. We have the young chef thinking, I'm an artist too, aren't I? Why not, if not? And I want to communicate emotion with my diners through color and form. And that led to the creation of the Kandinsky salad, served on a canvas, 30-element, healthy bit of food. Here you see it at home, kind of experiments in the wild, Chef Charles Michel, 12 Kandinsky salads. And because you're eating a painting, we've got to serve it on a painting canvas. And because you're eating a painting, what better to eat it with than a paintbrush? Because your lips are very sensitive, and so having the paintbrush bristles against your lips is a very tactile experience. And it really seemed to work in this kind of environment. So then we test in cafes, restaurants. And here at my own college, Somerville College in Oxford, we had 150 people coming for lunch. Half got the Kandinsky-inspired salad, half got the tossed version of the same ingredients. And you can see the difference in the willingness to pay for exactly the same food if it's plated aesthetically. And you might think, well, it looks like there's more food on the left because it's kind of spread out on the plate. And that could be a part of the story, but it's not the whole thing. Organized plating by itself is not enough, but it seems to be something about the eye appeal and the aesthetics that really carries over to the food. And so here we can work with these culinary creatives and take the sort of, psychological, psychophysical approach to assessment of the impact of their artistic creations on the value, tastiness of food. And so a really nice kind of collaboration between the chef who can't do statistics and the statistician who can't cook. Put them together and you might have a great experiment on your hands. Here's just another way we go about it with a Sao Paulo chef, Albert Landgraf, with his Apis restaurant. We just saw this dish online. I've never been to his restaurant, but it's all over the internet as an example of gastro-porn. And we were sort of caught our eye because it's sort of got Gestalt grouping in there. We've got 3 onions and they're all pointing in the same direction, and they're all pointing away from the diner. Why? Does it matter? We got in touch with the chef, interviewed him, and he says, it's not random, I thought about it, I played a bit, and it will always go out from the kitchen in this orientation, pointing away with the onions in alignment. But how much does that matter, really? With the chef's permission, we took his dish, put it on the internet, and started spinning it, and then invited people for 6 cents each to say, if you were going to Albert's restaurant tonight, how would you like this dish served? No right answers, and I don't know who you are, so you might just click and get your money and spend it. But in fact, people do tend to take these things seriously. And here we have, within an hour of putting the study up online, we have 250 respondents, with each dot in the rose plot their preferred orientation. Wait a couple of days, and we got over 2,000 people judging their preference for the appearance of this dish. Now, in this case, you can see most of those dots are congregating around 12 o'clock. The chef sends it out at 12 o'clock. 2,000 people say 4 minutes past 12. It's the perfect. But probably it's within the region of error. So in this case, the chef did not need the science to back up their intuition. They got it right. But it's a principle that you could test culinary creativity in an almost immediate fashion, very cheaply, does seem to have a lot of potential, I think, to then create more visually appealing dishes that people will be willing to pay more for. So that's all good. But what about the sort of the Gestalt? Well, this is one of those images that have been in psychology, visual perception textbooks for decades. I think from the 1950s was the original, I guess, I think. There's a wonderful example of emergence that looks like noise until you see the Dalmatian dog sniffing the leaves in the grass. With its head here and legs here. And what's interesting about this is both the fact that once you see the dog, once emergence has taken place, you can never unsee it. And even if you haven't seen this picture for decades, you'll immediately see the dog. So something's flipped in you, the viewer. And also the fact that the dog emerges at once, as a whole. You don't see a leg and say, I wonder what that leg is. Is it a zebra or something? It all emerges at once. One might think, are there any analogies there to the world of flavour? Could you have emergence in the world of flavour? Maybe you're tasting a wine and you don't know quite what it is, and then suddenly you figure out where you were, who you were with, which wine it is. It all emerges in an instant, perhaps. But this is one of the Gestalt phenomena and visual illusions that I've been sharing with the London chef, Youssef, the young man we saw before, who's interested in thinking in new ways about food he presents. And he went away, and this is what he came back with. And again, he's a chef who will only ever serve one meat course, animal protein, on the menu. It has to be one, but he wants to nudge you away by giving you mushrooms and jellyfish and lots of other stuff. So that one meat course has to be there, but he wants to make you think very carefully about it. And before the dish comes out, the chef comes out to the diners and says, I'm going to serve you the Picasso dish next. Why is it called Picasso? Well, Picasso was an artist, and he has the great line that every act of creation begins with an act of destruction. And that resonates with me as the chef, because I take beautiful natural ingredients, and then I smash them, I slice them, I whisk them, I dice them, I destroy them to create a beautiful dish. And then you will destroy my beautiful dish to savour the flavours of it. But before I give you the Picasso dish, I'm just going to go off to the kitchen and catch your dinner. And this plays in the restaurant. Squirmish, giggly, and a bit nervous. But the chef's whole point is, if you don't want to know what happened to the animal before it made its way to your table, why are you eating it? But done in a playful way, and it's kind of the sound of the sea for the sort of land-living animals. Then the dish comes out. And he says, can you see what's in the plate? And this was served in a London restaurant to 100 diners over 4 services. And only 4 people could see what's in the plate to begin with. Can anyone see? If I cover up the microgreens and the beetroot, the duck, and imitate the right half of the plate. You see Picasso staring out, his beady eyes, his bald pate, his white nose in the middle. And suddenly Picasso emerges from the plate. And you hear that, going around the restaurant. You have the aesthetic aha that probably elevates people's experience of the dish. And within a few minutes, 95 out of 100 diners have seen Picasso. He's emerged from the dish. And then once you've seen Picasso, you can never unsee him, I think. So we're kind of in the kitchen going, surely everyone will get this. There's no, and in fact, no, until you see it, you don't, and then when you do, you can't not see it. But a very nice example of gastroporn, bringing in the auditory element based on the Gestalt sort of principle of emergence. And maybe the last example I will share with you is from bistable perception. And this is the duck-rabbit illusion. And I like this one for a number of reasons. That Jastrow was using this back in the 1890s at a time when they were already trying to do these sort of science-public interactions. That's very popular these days in the UK again. We have the duck-rabbit. I showed it to the chef and said, can you do anything with that? And he went away and thought about it, came back 2 months later with this. He had to check, are duck and rabbit sustainable? Yes, they are-ish. Do they work together from a chef's perspective in terms of flavour? Yes, they do. And then he created an edible duck-rabbit dish, which we then took from the kitchen, put it online again, and showed it to 1,000 people for 6 cents each, varying the orientation, just to try and find the point of maximum uncertainty, so that when the diners are at the table, half of them say duck, half of them say rabbit. It creates the kind of contrast. And the more you have, I guess, the beak going horizontally, the more the pointy thing goes up. It looks like ears. Also, this is a nice dish in a sense that I think researchers here in Italy have shown that you're more likely to see the rabbit at Easter time. There's kind of a seasonal variation in the experience of this duck-rabbit illusion. And my question as a psychologist is to say, if your visual perception is alternating between duck and rabbit, will that bias or change your taste perception? Because if it did, this might be the world's first flavour-changing dish. Tastes like duck? No, it doesn't. It tastes like rabbit. Back and forth. That'd be kind of fun if it worked. So here's the final version as it was served in the restaurant. See the plate with a handle, because now you can turn the plate to change the orientation into that sort of point of maximum uncertainty. So we've got vision that's going back and forth, duck, rabbit, duck, rabbit. Then we want...
It's rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season.
The auditory soundscape going back and forth. It's duck, it's rabbit, it's duck, it's rabbit.
Fire!
Simultaneously probably triggering nostalgia, happy childhood memories of cartoons. Add that together with a projection mapping on the table of the Looney Tunes, and hopefully, if audition's alternating, vision is bistable, what happens to flavour? And again, we have the diners in the restaurant with a scorecard rating their response. I suspect in the end, I haven't really dared to look at the results in detail. I think the flavour does not flip. But maybe that's interesting. It tells us maybe that flavour is sort of slower than the other senses in terms of creating or changing the interpretation that one has. So with that, I think I will leave it. Just one final little example to come back to the point that was raised earlier and bring things full circle from the technology being brought to the world's top restaurant to modify the taste of the food. And this is our example of kind of explicitly composed music designed to bring out taste. Multisensory tasting menu in London, one course for each sense, and it's the final course, the Sonic Cake Pop. Please take out your phone, dial 08 645 2419. If you want to make your dessert more bitter, dial one number. If you want to make your dessert more sweet, dial a different number. So this is the first example of sonic seasoning in a restaurant. And here we have a diner in the restaurant eating something bitter, sweet, dark chocolate lolly for his dessert, using his own technology to season the food, bringing out about 5 to 10% sweetness. That's a very low-pitched sound, because the lower the sound, the more bitter. And this was the other sound we played through people's own technology. Those were our first attempts at constructed soundscapes to bring out taste, demonstrated in the lab and in the restaurant. But since then, we've been able to go on and create with designers, composers, producers, pieces of music that are better representations of specific tastes, flavors, textures, spiciness. And this comes from a London designer, and the sweetest music that is known. We've tested thousands and thousands of people at the Science Museum in London with many composers' creations designed to match taste. We can find which sound is best for the taste, and then look back and see what was it about the soundscape that was so good, as the pitch, the tempo, or so on. And this was then played in a Beijing cafe, with the idea being, if you play sweet music all day long, you could potentially reduce the sugar in the cakes, drinks, and pastries, keep the perception in the mind of the customer the same, but be a little healthier as a result. Done just as a marketing intervention, I have to say. So I'd want to see the long-term impact of sweet music. I don't have an answer to that yet, but nevertheless hinting at the way in which you can take some of the insights from this kind of creative interface between the culinary artists and the science lab to inspire one and the other to create dishes that then themselves can become experiments that can help to maybe move your theorizing along further. And with that, I shall finish. Thank you.
Questions? Short questions. Before dinner, experimental or traditional, whatever. Please.
So, very brief question, very simple. Do you think that this type of cross-modal stimulation, like for instance the sonic sweetener, is actually changing the sensitivity of your taste system, changing the threshold for sweet? Or do you think this is just some kind of criterion change? Changing the criterion that people use for labeling things as sweet or...
I think it can do both, depending on how you set things up. Clearly, in some of the when the Sonic Cake Pop came on the restaurant menu, that was sort of done by a culinary artist, and I think she was sort of smart to sort of say to people, dial up this if you want bitter, because that's sort of leading and might lead to response bias, and that can, I think, lead to bigger effects. But what we have done is we've done experiments in restaurants in Nashville, Tennessee, with spicy music that was just playing in the background of the restaurant. So no demand characteristics, you're just rating a dish of spicy mango salad. That's it. There happens to be some music playing and can show significant effects there. There are others who've shown, at least with shapes, that you can have a sub-threshold or sort of masked round booba or kiki shapes on the screen, and that changes threshold for sweetness. So shapes that aren't seen. My student Janice Wang in Denmark now has the neuroimaging data doing sonic seasoning in the scanner and claims she's got something in primary taste cortex. I think more generally, I sort of imagine it's you can't turn water into wine through music at all. So you have to have something there to begin with, and you can modulate that experience. And then it helps if it's a complex tasting experience to begin with, because there's more stuff going on and your brain can't capture it all. It helps if you're not quite sure what you're tasting, because if you know it's Coca-Cola, you know what Coca-Cola tastes like, so you don't need to taste it to give a response. So it should be complex. If it's a bit uncertain, that's great. That might be why wine works well. And then we're sort of, by finding the matching sounds for tastes, we're sort of drawing your attention to something in the tasting experience in much the same way as if I said, this is going to taste really bitter, that would modulate primary taste cortex, has been shown in several studies. And we're just not using words, we're just using sort of, the sounds instead, or the shapes. And that again, I think, is drawing your attention. By drawing your attention to one element in that sort of complex experience, that will, I guess, turn up the gain.
One more question, please.
So I like this idea of leveraging on this kind of implicit association, like the sonic sweetener. And because, of course, you cue, in this case, for example, the sweet taste, and then you alter the perception. You taste sweet where maybe it's not even there. But I would not be surprised also for the opposite direction of the effect, namely, you cue sweetness, and then you start craving sweetness. Is there something that you can comment about it?
So certainly, yes, you can, from the marketing literature, control scarily well both how much people consume, how quickly they consume, what kind of product they choose in supermarket or restaurant. And it's true that most of our research has been on just on your perception of something already created. But my colleagues in Finland have been doing studies where they get people to mix a smoothie themselves. And you've got like 3 acidic fruits, 3 very sweet fruits. Just make yourself a drink now. And there they can show in that kind of, in the composition of a taste, you'll end up making a sweeter smoothie with sweet music. So it is biasing you in the direction which might not be necessarily great, as you say. But what we also do is vary the timing. So sometimes we've done studies, does the music have to be playing at the same time you taste? Would it work if it plays before? Or could I play the music after the taste and still influence? And there we find that music ahead or during works best, but not after. And I believe my colleague Matoki in Japan has studied from an ice cream store where the correspondence of the pitch of the voice of the announcement changes how much sweet toppings you put on. So again, is nudging you in a bad direction rather than helping you to avoid. But on the flip side, I suppose, the thing is from many of the food and drinks companies, they say we're being told to reduce sugar, salt and fat in products, but when we do that, consumers complain and say, what are you doing to my favourite chocolate bar? Put it back the way it was. So for that situation, this might help. But yeah, a good note of caution.